This is your World War III update. So today I'm going to be doing a chronological expose to show you how we are in fact closer to nuclear war right now than ever before, especially in light of the intensifying conciliatory rhetoric that we are hearing between the Russians and the Americans. You see, there is an inverse correlation between the reassuring language that politicians are using about peace and the actual military mobilization and the deployment of increasingly more sophisticated weapon systems on the ground. I'm going to illuminate all of this for you in just a moment, but I call this the pacification paradox because as we approach an actual major conflict, it's in most leaders' vested interests to engage in performative philanthropy. And in fact, the more gratuitous this becomes, the more likely that a major inflection point in a conflict is on the horizon. This is going to be totally evidentiary. You're going to see everything I talk about here today has been well documented. It's just that things are progressing so fast that oftentimes it's moving so quickly that you can't really connect the dots between what's actually going on. So what we're seeing right now is appeasement of the population because they don't want to panic people, they don't want people to protest, and they want to also convey themselves as good faith negotiators. And indeed, both the Russians and the Americans are trying to encourage the other side that they're not engaged in any sort of perfidious backstabbery. Perfidy is an excellent term to describe the machinations that are currently taking place in a lot of these backstabbing negotiations that go on in the world, whether it was the one that we recently seen with Iran, where the United States was planning on doing a final set of negotiations and they decided to go in for a decapitation strike. The same element of misdirection is currently at play. So people right now are being brainwashed and hypnotized into believing what the politicians are saying, completely oblivious to the fact of what's going on. Let me walk you through this. Back in 2019, Donald Trump left the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, when I say, I'm just going to not say the name of Trump or Biden, I'm just going to refer to them as POTUS, because it's a continuity of agenda, and I know a lot of sensitive people get really triggered when you start to take jabs at their team, because of course it's a sport in the United States. Now, there was a missile test that was conducted of an intermediate range nuclear capable missile at the same time. They also withdrew from the Open Sky Treaty at that time. This is very important because this allowed adversarial nations to survey the airspace of opposing countries to ensure that they weren't engaged in any sort of shenanigans. So we no longer have an Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is arguably one of the most important treaties, because this essentially doubled the amount of time with this treaty in place that it would take for a nuclear war to escalate, because these intermediate nuclear missiles can reach their targets, they can launch from shorter distances, and they are much faster. Okay, so they reach their targets much quicker than an ICBM, say, launched from the ocean. One of these things launched from Germany, for example, into Russia would be very quick. Now, arguably, the United States claimed that Russia was doing this beforehand, which is why they backed out of the treaty. I always tell you both sides of the story. Now, Trump at that time also sanctioned Nord Stream. Okay, then we had that 2021 peace summit where Biden and Putin shook hands. Okay, that was that reassurance aspect that I'm talking about. They reassure the population, everything is fine. Russia does a major military exercise in 2021 called the Zapad exercises, which included up to 200,000 troops in Belarus. And then, of course, they invaded Ukraine in 2022. So everything Russia does is in red. Everything the U.S. does is in black. So this is tit for tat. And this, honestly, from this point here, 2022 to 2024, so much happened in terms of nuclear escalation. I do not have a board or enough data on this card to talk about. So Biden, of course, does Nord Stream. He tacitly admitted that he was going to destroy it, and then lo and behold, it got destroyed through, various proxies, friends of friends of friends of friends types thing, plausible deniability. Then we had nuclear escalation in late 2022. Sergei Shoigu called the POTUS and said, hey, this thing's getting out of control. He called Lloyd Austin at the time, and there was all this de-escalatory exchanges that went on. But we continued to progress until, of course, Trump was elected. Syria fell, which was a Russian proxy within the region, effectively acting as a bulwark for Russia's southern flank. Trump got elected. Remember, the INF Treaty was exited under Trump, the supposed friend of Vladimir Putin. As I'm going to show you, nothing could be further from the truth. What does Russia do immediately after or in and around that election period? They launch the Orezhnik intermediate range nuclear capable missile. Okay? It's all starting to make sense. Now, Trump immediately, once he gets into office, he starts promoting a Golden Dome defensive system. Well, defense, what's the big deal, you say? Well, this, of course, is shrouded in mystery, but there's elements of this Golden Dome which could, in fact, be used for offensive purposes, right? And if you have a really formidable defense, like I'm talking a really good defense, where you can almost effectively reduce the risk of succumbing to a nuclear strike to close to zero, then that puts the other guy on edge, because he thinks, well, if they do a decapitation strike on me, I'm not going to have any leverage in this debate, so they might be more enticed to, escalate sooner than later if they believe this is actually the case. But really, the whole space component of this is shrouded in mystery. The rapidity of developing SpaceX is kind of an enigma at this point as to what they're really up to. It's not about Mars or anything like that. That's all just, FUD for the masses. Then at the same time, he encouraged Europe to start bumping up their military spend to 5% of their GDP, of which the United States would sell them weapons. And Pete Hegseth, the new defense minister in the United States, openly called this a division of labor. Okay? So, in his first month of office, basically does one of the most strategically egregious things that you could do to a peer-to-peer nuclear competitor, and encourages Europe to boost its military spend to 5% so that they can get in a war with Russia someday. Now, what we have happen next is Operation Spiderweb. This happened under Trump's watch. We must remember this, with pretty much no pushback from Trump himself. The Ukrainians, who are, of course, funded, directed, administrated by NATO, decided that they were going to try to take out as many Russian nuclear bombers as they possibly could. And they were rather successful in this respect. This around the same time, about a couple weeks later, they ran a similar Palantir-driven operation when they bombed Iran and when they tried to do that decapitation strike on Iran. Now, the B-2 bomber was really, possibly, I should say, a trial run for what they might attempt. And that's going to come in handy in terms of understanding this B-2 flyover over Putin's head in just a moment. So after all that subsides, Putin issues a nuclear submarine threat. There was a lot of other little minutia, strategic minutia that arose from this point forward, nuclear exercises and all this stuff, but these are the most salient points. So Putin issues a nuclear submarine threat, insisting that they have a unique type of technology that enables their submarines, particularly the ones in the Arctic, to operate in a more covert fashion, and that this is a attribute of their submarines that only they possess. It could have something to do with their nuclear icebreakers that potentially clear the way for these submarines. Who knows what it is? Regardless, what I forgot to mention was all that talk about Greenland. Okay, remember, we're going to annex Greenland. Well, who the hell cares about Greenland, right? Anything that you could get in Greenland, you can get in the United States. Well, this is what it was all about, okay? So anyways, we have nightly ICBM movements around this time, because no longer are they truly honoring the New START treaty. There's no mutual inspection. So now the Russians don't need to notify the United States when their mobile nuclear platforms are maneuvering around. And of course, this essentially would give them advantage if a nuclear war broke out, because we wouldn't be able to effectively target their systems, especially at night when they would be less detectable by satellite. There are ways you can do it, but they're not foolproof like you can during the day. Also, around this time, the doomsday radio starts blaring 24/7, and I think it's still going to this day, releasing different types of code. This is a Russian radio station which was historically throughout the Cold War called the Doomsday Radio Station. Okay, it actually started to sound when the Ukraine war began, and then it restarted again after Trump's election. Now, what does Trump do? He moves nuclear weapons into the UK. Again, I said I wasn't going to say Trump, the POTUS, because this plan was initiated long before Trump. Okay, they were getting Lakenheath ready for these. I talked about this in late 2023, and I'm sure that plan was underway a lot sooner than that. So they're getting the B-61 tactical bombers in there. They've been slowly moving more F-35 nuclear-capable planes towards the Russian periphery. And so they're slowly kind of getting prepared for this decapitation strike, leveraging Ukraine's drone strikes as a sort of reconnaissance by fire in order to try to figure out Russians' defenses. Now, then we had that spat between Trump and Medvedev. And you'll notice that the timelines are contracting here, right? Because for starters, I mean, this is all what's fresh in our memory. And, you know, so much has happened back here, but things are actually accelerating, even though it seems, again, because of that reassurance paradox, it seems when they talk more and more about peace, and there's a reason why when Putin and Trump had that banner behind them that said peace and prosperity, there's a reason, because they're trying to unconsciously inject that into people's minds when in fact the complete opposite is true. We're in fact inexorably hurtling towards a nuclear conflagration. So Medvedev threatens the dead hand system, and I can't remember exactly what provoked that. I think it was Trump's 50-day ultimatum. That is right. My chronology might not be entirely correct here, but Trump issues the ultimatum. Medvedev issues the threat that, hey, if you try to do that decapitation strike that you did with Iran, that we have a system called the dead hand, the perimeter system, that will launch all of our nukes if Vladimir Putin is taken out. Dmitry Medvedev, say what you want about him, but he is the deputy of the National Security Council. Who is the head of the National Security Council? That's Vladimir Putin. He is next in line, okay, in terms of who has the final say on national security. If Putin's gone, this is the guy who takes the reins, okay? Whether or not he's actually going to act on this belligerent talk is another story. Now, Russia officially abrogates the INF. They leave the INF treaty that Trump left back in 2019. The Americans claim that the Russians were violating it all along, and in fairness, they did launch the Irrefutable missile, which would qualify as a intermediate nuclear-capable missile. So they officially got rid of that, you know, because that's kind of just the less aggressive way of showing your disdain for the other side, which is not necessarily going to be directly escalatory because they weren't party to it anymore, really. Anyways, Trump makes the threat to deploy nuclear submarines, claims that he deployed 2 nuclear submarines towards Russia. Now, again, you never know if such a claim is just purely for the masses because, of course, these nuclear submarines operate in secret. They're likely always out there on the prowl somewhere. So is this just a moot point to call attention to it? And is this just their way of kind of telegraphing their dislike for the other side, whatever it is they're doing at that point in time? Possibly. Russia starts to send plane load after plane load of presumably missile defense systems to Iran at this period of time. In fact, it was openly discussed in Western mainstream media for the first time that Iran was receiving S-400 missile defense systems in and around this time. This is when, of course, the Alaska summit happens. Everything is kind of going to a crescendo, and then all of a sudden, we have suddenly a peace summit, which is being discussed. Putin agrees to come to the summit because I think he knows that the stakes are very high at this point, and they do a ceremonial B-2 bomber flyover Putin's head, which of course was a symbolic decapitation strike. It's a message that what we did here can happen to Moscow, okay? Now, Russia starts to ramp up their preparations for a Burevestnik test. This is a nuclear-powered nuclear missile. This is in the Novaya Zemlya region. So in response to that, NATO starts to mobilize its nuke-sniffing planes, all of its ISR assets in the Arctic. Around this time, we have B-1 bombers. This was just a few days ago now. We're already like within the span of the last few days for these last two rows. B-1 bombers in Latvia made an appearance. Now, these are not nuclear capable. At least they were at one point. They claim that they're not anymore. Regardless, clearly a show of force. Ukraine unveils its own technically intermediate nuclear capable missile, not as fast as the Irrefutable and as unstoppable. It wouldn't be like an equivalent hypersonic style missile. Nonetheless, it has an exceptional range, the Flamingo missile. And then, of course, Trump has been making some rather backhanded statements about how, you know, if I was Biden, I would have allowed Ukraine to do deep strikes into Russia and that you can't win by playing defense, that sort of thing. So that rhetoric ratchets up. All the while these changes are coming into play, you won't hear a peep about this on Russian media because they are playing along with the whole facade. They don't want to panic their population, okay? So Putin the other day visited Nuclear Command. It was a very ceremonial thing. It was the 80th anniversary, I believe, but a lot of people suspect that they were just making sure that everything, all systems go, just in case the shit hits the fan. It was very underreported in terms of, you know, how many people were present at this gathering. I think Gerasimov was there and some of his other high-ranking generals, as well as members of, what is it called, Rosatom? Or Roscosmos, that's what it is, Roscosmos, their NASA equivalent, okay? So Trump sends ERAM, so 3,500 approximately longer-range missiles that could potentially reach Moscow to the Ukrainians while they're conducting nuclear plant attacks and attacking Russian critical infrastructure. All the while, Russia remains completely quiet, right? They're doing tit-for-tat exchanges, back and forth, oil refineries. Neither leader is calling attention to this. Just yesterday, I think we're at now, there was Russian incursions into the air identification zone in and around Alaska, but 3 times in the last 5 days, okay? NATO has recently done another ISR search with Constant Phoenix in and around the Baltic Sea. We have the ECB 6B command and control plane now deployed to Patufic Air Force Base in the Arctic. We have nuke sniffing going on in the Baltic in and around a region, the Gotland Island, where the power outage was recently, and of course all kinds of shenanigans go on in the Baltic. But that there's a nuclear sniffer there is interesting. So do they actually suspect that there's a Russian nuclear submarine in those waters? I would suspect as much. Russia prepares for the Zapad 2025 exercise. Of course, that's the exercise that preceded the Ukrainian invasion. This could potentially involve up to 150,000 troops, which is saying a lot when you're in a massive war and you appear to be making very, very slow progress. Trump today reiterated that the United States will backstop European security guarantees to Ukraine, effectively involving them in the conflict should the security be violated, which would be something that was very easy to orchestrate, okay? This is why I'm so concerned about this security guarantee stuff, because if you really wanted the war to continue, you could either easily provoke the Russians or you could stage a false flag. And the Russians are not notorious for their being media savvy. They are very by-the-book, professional, judicious people, but in terms of their ability to, manipulate the minds of the masses and basically defy these false characterizations, they're not really that good at that. They're not really good at defending themselves internationally through media. There's a lot of influencers who kind of toe that party line, but it's probably would be insufficient if the false flag was of sufficient magnitude. In addition to that, in the last couple of days, we have new rumors about weapons deployments to Venezuela, possibly Shahed drones, even Reznik missiles, which seems like a stretch. If we're talking about Reznik missiles deployed in Venezuela, then it would be no surprise why they have the Navy that is currently conglomerating outside their waterways. And obviously, I think that there's other motives, likely by way of oil. But I think that another potential reason why they're doing that is for strategic positioning and wanting to get rid of that potential threat. So they're slowly attriting not only Russia's economy, but also their proxy network from Armenia and Azerbaijan to Syria to Iran and basically all over the map now, South America and Venezuela. Putin recently has been making a lot of phone calls to China, to India, to all the BRICS, attempting to try to consolidate, make sure everybody is on the same page. And of course, we're approaching the 2-week deadline, which is set to kick off here in early September, just before these APAD 2025 exercises that are going to simulate the use of nuclear weapons on Rezniks in Belarus. So that's basically it. And we had an incursion into Russian airspace today stemming from Estonia. So all along, I suspected that the Ukrainians were likely firing these drones either from boats on the Baltic Sea or from the Baltic states themselves. Now, if they're trying to provoke the Russians to attacking Estonia, because this would be, the Russians are ignoring it at this point in time because I think they see the setup here. Get Estonia to fire some drones, but don't make it official. The Russians will have to respond, and then that's going to invoke Article 5. Either way, I think I've clearly demonstrated that all of this conciliatory rhetoric that we're hearing right now is completely detached from reality. I mean, you have people today posting about how they think the Ukraine war is over and the Ukraine has folded, even though Europe is committing, $100 billion a year. The U.S. just committed a bunch of new weapons. The United States is backstopping with security guarantees. Donald Trump is not speaking about any of this. And remember when, right after Trump got elected, I said that isn't it suspicious that Trump, Mr. Anti-War President, isn't calling attention to the fact that Biden was allowing Ukraine to do deep strikes? Isn't it strange that they weren't making a big issue about that? Well, I think now we know why. So this is the paradox, okay? It's that as we approach what could be a potential flashpoint, you're also going to see the peace talk ramp up. So it's inversely proportional. The more they talk about peace, the more they're really, in fact, getting ready for war. So I hope I made it abundantly clear today. I mean, I don't know what else there is to say. There is no reason at this point in time to believe a word that either leaders say. And I want to emphasize this because this isn't just about Trump. This isn't just about the POTUS. The Russians are lying to their population as well because they know that if people understood the truth, that things were actually escalating with Trump and that this whole charade wasn't just that, then people would be kind of concerned, and that might spook the markets a little bit. Nobody wants to disrupt the stock market, especially the MOEX, which is, barely treading water at this point in time. Some people say, oh yeah, the Russian economy is doing just amazing right now. Well, they've had their oil and gas exports significantly cut back, and oil is down significantly. And so, they're not... They don't just have like an endless coffer to draw from to fund this war. There are certain limits. And at some point, the strategy is going to flip, I do think. The question is, what could cause both sides to become more aligned in terms of the belligerence where it should be, which is if the narrative was reflective of this reality, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin would be duking it out on Twitter, okay? Now people say, oh no, it's better that we're engaged in this sort of diplomatic facade. But the problem with that is, well, there's a lot of problems. I think I've already made it abundantly clear. But the problem is that both sides have a vested interest in drawing it out. And that means that it's not until they actually start to go mask off, kind of like Trump did today, in fact, that you can actually have a glimmer of hope. Because one would think that the reverse of this rule was also true, that if they started to talk about war, then maybe they're actually looking at some sort of peaceful resolution. And today, Trump kind of let something slip. In one of his many press conferences, he said that, you know, when asked whether or not Putin will accept, you know, the terms offered by Ukraine, and Trump just said, you know, who cares what they think, right? Essentially. So essentially, you know, nullifying all of the deference that he had showed to Putin and Russia up until this point. So that's what's going on, guys. I mean, just watch what happens. I'm betting the house on this, and it's unfortunate because I don't want it to happen, but this is what they're getting ready to do. Day X is, and just watch. Just watch what happens. And I'm not saying it's going to be like boom, bada bing, and nukes are going to be flying everywhere. I'm just saying that the whole facade is going to crumble. What happens after we cross that Rubicon, I don't know. I mean, maybe both sides chicken out, and maybe we pull back from the brink. And maybe, in fact, when we do get the real clash, like the Elon versus Trump moment between Putin and Trump, maybe that's when we can actually start making some real progress towards diplomacy. But that moment is coming, mark my words, because the reality is plain as day. I mean, I've made it abundantly clear at this point. I've not heard one good argument from any one of these pundits who make the claim that what we're hearing is actually real, okay? And everybody has their biases. I have my biases, but I try to really view this objectively, which is why a lot of people from both sides don't want to come on the channel, because they know I'm not just going to give them softball questions. I'm going to ask questions in a very respectful way, but I'm going to ask them the questions that may reveal how their certain pieces of the puzzle are missing in their arguments. So let me know what you think about this chronology, and what do you think is going to happen next? Because based on my calculations, it's now Russia's move, and this can be seen as a long game of chess. And now it's in Russia's hands. So we're going to find out if this deadline that's set to expire on September 5th next week, at least that's the date according to my calculations, if there's going to be any real repercussions or if it's just going to be another taco type situation. Thanks for watching, guys. Gotta go. Go check out the Canadian Prepper channel if you want real prepping advice. Take care.